Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Between 1989 and 1991, 3 Indigenous children vanished from a small Aboriginal mission in Bowraville, New South Wales. 16-year-old Colleen Walker-Craig, 4-year-old Evelyn Greenup, and 16-year-old Clinton Speedy Daru all disappeared within months of each other. Their remains were found along the same stretch of road, except for Colleen, whose weighted-down clothes were discovered in a nearby river. Despite strong evidence and a clear suspect, no one has ever been convicted of these crimes. The investigation was plagued by racism, police negligence, and a justice system that seemed designed to fail these families. Tonight we dive into one of Australia's most haunting unsolved cases, the Bowraville murders. In the quiet town of Bowraville, nestled in the mid-north coast region of New South Wales, Australia, a series of devastating events would forever change the lives of multiple families and expose deep-seated issues within Australia's justice system. The events that unfolded between 1989 and 1991 would become one of the most haunting unsolved cases in Australian criminal history. Bowraville was home to a significant Aboriginal population, many of whom lived in what was known as the Mission, a predominantly Indigenous community on the outskirts of town. Like many rural Australian communities in the late 1980s, Bowraville was marked by racial divisions and social inequality that would later prove crucial to understanding how these crimes were initially investigated. The first disappearance occurred on September 13, 1990, when 16-year-old Colleen Walker-Craig vanished after attending a party in the Mission. Colleen was a vibrant teenager, described by her family as responsible and reliable. When she didn't return home that night, her mother, Muriel Craig, immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't like Colleen at all. She always let someone know where she was going. The response from local police was tepid at best. When Muriel reported her daughter missing, she was told that Colleen had probably gone walkabout, a dismissive and racist assumption that would later be recognized as part of a pattern of institutional prejudice. The police suggested that Colleen would return when she was ready, despite her family's insistence that this behavior was completely out of character. Just weeks after Colleen's disappearance on October 3, 1990, 4-year-old Evelyn Greenup vanished from her grandmother's home in the Mission. Evelyn had been sleeping in the house after a party, and her absence wasn't discovered until the morning. The circumstances were suspicious from the start. A 4-year-old child doesn't simply walk away in the middle of the night. The community was already on edge from Colleen's disappearance, and Evelyn's case heightened their fears. But again, the police response was inadequate. Reports suggest that officers spent minimal time investigating, treating the disappearance as though it were a routine custody dispute rather than a potential abduction. Then, on January 31, 1991, 16-year-old Clinton Speedy Daru disappeared. Clinton had been staying at his girlfriend's house in the Mission and was last seen sleeping on a couch in the early hours of the morning. When his girlfriend woke up, Clinton was gone, leaving behind his shoes and wallet, items his family knew he would never willingly abandon. The pattern was becoming clear to the Aboriginal community, but the police continued to treat each case in isolation. It wasn't until Clinton's body was discovered on February 18, 1991, in bushland along Congarini Road, that authorities began to take the cases more seriously. Clinton had been murdered, and the manner of his death indicated a brutal attack. The discovery of Clinton's body led to a more thorough search of the area, and on April 27, 1991, the remains of little Evelyn Greenup were found in similar bushland, not far from where Clinton had been discovered. The community's worst fears were confirmed. They had a serial killer in their midst. Colleen Walker-Craig's body has never been found, though her clothes were discovered weighted down with rocks in the Nambucca River. The discovery of her clothing, combined with the circumstances of her disappearance and its similarities to the other cases, led investigators to conclude that she had also been murdered. As the investigation progressed, a suspect emerged, a non-Indigenous man who had been living in the community and had connections to all 3 victims. He had been seen at the parties before each disappearance and was known to spend time with young Aboriginal people from the mission. The suspect had even been in a relationship with a young Aboriginal woman and had access to many of the homes in the community. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns. The suspect would often attend parties at the mission, supplying alcohol to minors and inserting himself into the community despite not being Indigenous himself. He was known to give rides to young people and had been seen with each of the victims before their disappearances. But the investigation was hampered by several factors. The initial delays in treating the disappearances seriously had led to the loss of crucial evidence. The racial dynamics of the community and the historical distrust between Aboriginal people and law enforcement made some witnesses reluctant to come forward, and the police work itself was later criticised as being inadequate and influenced by institutional racism. The families of the victims, however, never gave up. They organised searches, held community meetings, and kept pressure on the authorities to continue investigating. They faced not only the devastating loss of their children, but also the frustration of dealing with a justice system that seemed indifferent to their pain. The case would eventually lead to significant changes in how Australian authorities handle cases involving Indigenous victims, but those changes came too late for Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton. The initial failures in the investigation would have long-lasting consequences for the pursuit of justice. The investigation finally gained momentum when Detective Inspector Gary Jubelin took over the case in 1996. Jubelin would later describe the Bowraville murders as the most important case of his career, and he approached it with a dedication that the families had long been demanding. He spent countless hours in the community, building trust and gathering statements that should have been collected years earlier. The suspect was eventually arrested and charged with Clinton Speedy Daru's murder in 1991. However, the prosecution faced significant challenges. The rules of evidence at the time meant that each murder had to be tried separately, preventing the jury from seeing the full pattern of behavior that linked the 3 cases. The suspect was acquitted of Clinton's murder in 1994, devastating the families and the community. 2 years later, in 1996, the suspect was tried for Evelyn Greenup's murder. Again, the prosecution was unable to present evidence relating to the other victims, and once again, the suspect was acquitted. The families watched in horror as the man they believed responsible for killing their children walked free for a second time. What made these acquittals particularly painful was the wealth of circumstantial evidence that seemed to connect the cases. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the suspect with each victim before their disappearances. He had been at the parties where both Colleen and Clinton were last seen. Witnesses described him entering the house where Evelyn was sleeping on the night she vanished. There were even reports of him making incriminating statements, including telling one witness that little black kids could go missing from the mission and no one would care. The forensic evidence, though limited by the initial poor investigation, was also compelling. Clinton's body showed signs of blunt force trauma consistent with the suspect's known violent tendencies. Evelyn's remains indicated she had suffered a severe blow to the head. Both bodies were found in locations that the suspect was familiar with, along Congarini Road. The family's frustration with the justice system grew as they learned more about how the initial investigation had been botched. Critical evidence had been lost or contaminated. Witness statements hadn't been properly recorded. The crime scenes hadn't been adequately secured. These failures would continue to haunt the case for decades to come. In 2006, the New South Wales government changed the double jeopardy laws, allowing retrials in cases where fresh and compelling evidence emerged. This gave the families new hope. They had never stopped gathering evidence, never stopped pushing for justice, and never stopped telling their stories to anyone who would listen. Detective Inspector Jubilin continued to work on the case even after his retirement, supporting the family's efforts to have the cases retried. New witness statements were gathered, and forensic evidence was re-examined using modern techniques. The family's persistence led to multiple inquiries and reviews of the case. In 2016, after years of advocacy by the victims' families, the New South Wales Attorney General referred the case to the Court of Criminal Appeal. The application argued that there was fresh and compelling evidence that should allow for a retrial of the suspect for all 3 murders together. This would finally allow prosecutors to present evidence of the pattern of behaviour that linked the cases. The family's hopes were raised when the court agreed to hear the application. They packed the courtroom day after day, wearing T-shirts bearing the faces of their lost children. They listened as lawyers argued about legal technicalities and precedents, all while holding on to the belief that this time, finally, justice might be served. But in 2019, the Court of Criminal Appeal ruled against a retrial. The court found that while there was evidence linking the 3 murders, it wasn't fresh in the legal sense, because much of it had been available at the time of the original trials. The technical legal definition of fresh evidence had prevailed over what many saw as common sense and justice. The ruling was a devastating blow to the families and the community. They had fought for nearly 3 decades, watching their children's killer walk free while they carried the weight of their loss and the knowledge that the system had failed them at every turn. The impact of these murders and the subsequent failure to achieve justice extended far beyond the immediate families. They became a symbol of the broader injustices faced by Indigenous Australians in the criminal justice system. The cases highlighted how racist assumptions and institutional indifference could allow a killer to escape punishment, simply because his victims were Aboriginal children. The Bowraville murders became a catalyst for change in Australian law enforcement and judicial procedures, but these changes provided little comfort to the families who had lost so much. The case exposed deep-rooted problems in how authorities handled crimes against Indigenous people, leading to reforms in police protocols and cultural sensitivity training. In the years following the Court of Criminal Appeal's 2019 decision, the families continued their fight for justice through different channels. They worked with advocacy groups and Indigenous rights organisations to push for further legal reforms. Their story became the subject of documentaries, books, and academic studies, all highlighting how the intersection of racism, institutional failure, and legal technicalities had prevented justice from being served. The impact on the Bowraville community has been profound and lasting. The mission, once a close-knit community despite its challenges, was forever changed by these murders. Many residents moved away, unable to bear living in a place marked by such tragedy and injustice. Those who stayed carried the weight of knowing that the perpetrator had walked freely among them for years. Detective Inspector Gary Jubilin, even after his retirement, continued to speak out about the case. In his 2020 memoir, he wrote, "The Bowraville murders represent everything that's wrong with our justice system when it comes to Indigenous Australians. These families deserved better. These children deserved better. And we, as a society, need to do better." The families of Colleen Walker-Craig, Evelyn Greenup, and Clinton Speedy Daru have shown remarkable resilience throughout their ordeal. They've transformed their grief into advocacy, speaking at conferences and forums about the need for justice system reform. Their persistence has inspired other Indigenous families facing similar struggles with the criminal justice system. In recent years, the case has been recognised as a significant example of what's known as Indigenous cold cases, murders and disappearances of Aboriginal people that remain unsolved due to inadequate initial investigations. The Bowraville murders have become a case study in law schools and police academies, teaching future legal professionals and law enforcement officers about the devastating consequences of institutional bias and investigative failures. The suspect, whose name is rarely mentioned out of respect for the family's wishes, has continued to live in New South Wales. While he maintains his innocence, his presence serves as a constant reminder of the justice system's failure to protect some of society's most vulnerable members. The families have reported seeing him in public spaces, a cruel reminder of their ongoing nightmare. One of the most poignant aspects of this case remains the search for Colleen Walker Craig's remains. Despite numerous searches over the years, her body has never been found, denying her family even the small comfort of being able to lay her to rest properly. The weighted clothes found in the Nambucca River stand as a silent testament to her fate, but her final resting place remains unknown. The case has also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence and conducting thorough initial investigations. Modern forensic techniques might have yielded different results if the crime scenes had been properly processed and preserved in 1990 and 1991. This realization has led to changes in evidence collection protocols, particularly in cases involving Indigenous victims. The legacy of the Bowraville murders extends beyond the immediate tragedy. It has become a rallying point for Indigenous rights activists and legal reformers who argue that the justice system must be overhauled to better serve Aboriginal communities. The case has influenced discussions about changing double jeopardy laws and how courts consider pattern evidence in serial crimes. Today, the families continue to honour the memories of their lost children. They hold annual memorial services and community gatherings, ensuring that Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton are not forgotten. These events serve not only as remembrances, but as continued calls for justice and reform. The Bowraville murders stand as a dark chapter in Australian history, a reminder of how prejudice and institutional failure can deny justice to those who need it most. While the legal avenues may appear exhausted, the families' fight for recognition and reform continues. Their story serves as both a warning about the consequences of systemic racism and a testament to the enduring strength of families seeking justice for their loved ones. As we reflect on this case, we must remember that somewhere, someone knows more than they've revealed. The families hold on to hope that one day, whether through a confession, new evidence, or a change in the law, justice will finally be served for Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton. Until then, their story remains a powerful reminder of the work still needed to ensure equal justice for all Australians, regardless of their background or heritage.